Hello, welcome back. And before I start, I'm going to say this. We still have this WhatsApp community that you can find under the same name. If you look for communities on WhatsApp and type in Talk ADHD with no space, TALK ADHD, you should find a community you can request to join. I'll put a link into it on the notes of this podcast as well. What's happened last week is they've given us some really useful information about the topics they would like us to talk about, the things they'd like to hear. And that's what this week's is all about. So this week, the title of this podcast is What is Good Anyway? What do we mean? Well, what does good look like when we're talking about the process that we should expect to go through if we seek an assessment or a diagnosis for ADHD? Whether it's for us or our children, doesn't matter. What does good look like? How do we know that we're getting the right standard of assessment and information? And very importantly, what happens next? What does good look like after you've been told that, for example, yes, it's ADHD? So there is no better person really to ask this question to than somebody doing this day in, day out, year in, year out, which is why Andrew is the man. This is going to be fascinating, I think. This is one of those where there's lots of misconceptions. There's lots of people have their own opinion. And hopefully what we're able to do, Andrew, is clear some of that up, really. So have you got anything you want to say before we sort of dive into how we're going to approach this?
No, just nice to be back after a week off.
Yes.
Yes, I think it's important to remember that we do this for free, and this is about just putting that information out there. So sometimes our work priorities do take over, and we do everything we can to get an episode out each week, but sometimes it's just not going to be possible. And last week was one of those.
Not bad after 7 episodes.
Here we are now, ready to go again. So,
right then. So, ready to go again. And you've kindly shared a document, and I will share a link to it, which is actually sort of a consensus document called Assessments for Adult ADHD, What Makes Them Good Enough. Now, this is some very senior and well-respected folks within the ADHD world, I believe, coming together to... I don't know, what would you call it? Is it guidelines? Is it?
It's a response to GPs saying what does a good ADHD assessment look like, and when they say assessment, they say they mean assessment report. But this document was sort of the leading psychiatrist saying these are the sorts of things that you should look for. So it was published in a journal that is circulated around general practice. So it was their attempt to say these are some signs that the assessment that you're reading is of a good quality and done by someone who knows what they're talking about.
Is that to mitigate issues then, I assume? Is that, in case a GP got a report and looked at it and went, not sure about this?
Well, yeah, it's to help guide their understanding, because a general practitioner is exactly that. They're a generalist. They're not a specialist, and they rely on what specialists tell them, and the regulation of those specialists to make sure that the information they're getting as GPs is reliable enough to support them in their work. Often the thing that undermines a shared care agreement can be the quality of an assessment. If you've got a good quality assessment report, that adds weight to the diagnosis, and therefore the confidence in, yes, this is actually ADHD, and therefore it's right to prescribe something for ADHD.
Right. Got you. Now, it's interesting, isn't it? So the title of this document, Assessments for Adult ADHD, What Makes Them Good Enough. Just to read the first paragraph. Concerns have been raised in the media over the quality of assessments for adult attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and the role of the private sector. And it goes on. It may not surprise anyone listening to hear that this was published in October of last year. And the reference point that it has for the media is, yes, the Panorama documentary. Now, I find that really interesting for a number of reasons. A, it's great to see that there was a response. I think that's phenomenal that it prompted a response to provide GPs with information about what good is. Interestingly for me, though, it automatically sort of answers a question that I had fired at me online post the documentary before we spoke about people suddenly perceiving that what was going on was there was some sort of backstreet clinics welcoming anyone and anyone who just fancied trying stimulant meds, doing some kind of a shoddy assessment, and then writing a prescription for stimulant meds. And from the get-go, I thought, well, that makes no sense because there's laws against that. I mean, it's a regulated process and industry. That surely can't be happening. What this tells me is no, the concern was over the quality and the differences in perhaps what assessments and assessment reports look like, not that they were being done, should we say, fraudulently or given to people that didn't meet the criteria. So have I got that right? Am I on the right lines with that?
I think so. You know, the 3 clinics featured in Panorama are doing what they do because they believe that what they do helps people with ADHD.
Right.
And that was never called to question. But the way things are done really does impact on the quality of the response that you can give. So it comes down to how the criteria are applied, how those diagnostic criteria are applied, and the depth of exploration of the experience that feeds an assessment.
Right.
So an assessment for ADHD is usually done under 2 classification systems. There's either the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, revision 5 we're at now. That's the American version, and that tends to be what most of us use. It's what we use at Divergence, and it's what most clinicians will use. There is also the International Classification of Diseases model, which is slightly different, but over the years has become more closely aligned to DSM criteria, to the point that they're much the same, where they weren't. And I suppose that says something about the refining and understanding of what a diagnosis of ADHD actually means. So that both of those manuals come with a list of symptoms and a list of other criteria that must be met in order to say, yes, this is ADHD. And it's possible, and we saw it on Panorama, to go through those questions and say, are you forgetful? Yes. Okay, that's that one covered. That's one of 18 symptoms ticked. But that doesn't really get to the depth of what that means in someone's life. So what I'd like to do is go through what is being asked and why it's being asked. Not necessarily all 18 symptoms, because that's something, you know, you can look up those 18 symptoms.
Yeah.
What a good assessment will do with those criteria, as opposed to just going through a tick box exercise of, yes, I've got that one. No, I had that one in childhood. It's gone now. I've got that one now, and it was there in childhood. So that there are complexities to how it's delivered, and I think that's where you see a good ADHD assessment, where you get that more rich exploration of the experience of living with this, rather than, you know, do you have purple toenails? Tick.
Not today. Okay, so give me some examples then. You know, you mentioned there forgetfulness, and you know, it's this thing. Everyone's a little bit ADHD. Everyone's a little bit. Everyone at some point loses something. Are we talking about if you lose something more regularly than someone else, and you reference that during an assessment, that might be well, that seems like ADHD, or does there, for you, need to be an extra element to that?
It's not as straightforward as saying yes, I lose things a lot. So there are 9 symptoms of inattention, 9 symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity. There's actually 6 hyperactive and 3 impulsive symptoms. And that split becomes useful later on, but let's take the first one. So often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, at work, or during other activities. So in my assessments, I'm not going to say, do you make careless mistakes? That's not how I would go about it, because that actually is just creating a tick box.
Mm.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
want to understand what your day's like. How do you go through your day, and what happens, and what are the things that go wrong in a day? And everybody has those, but by talking through that, we get a picture of these clusters of symptoms. I didn't always do it like that, Matt. So when I was first an ADHD specialist, I did rely more on almost a tick box exercise. And when I was teaching people in the NHS how to assess for ADHD, I used to get students to almost like fill out a bingo card. I would say,
Oh, okay.
here's a list of symptoms. If you hear that symptom in our conversation, tick it off on your list, to help people start to think about how the conversation and how I weave the conversation around those symptoms and capture them, rather than directly asking the question. So we didn't say we were going to talk a lot about Panorama, but there was this criticism on the Panorama show that he was talking about football. I don't know whether you remember that.
Yeah.
Well, actually, a skilled clinician will use things like that to distract people away from the stress of being asked about your ADHD symptoms. And often in an assessment, you'll get a gem from one of those distractions. So you'll take someone off and talk about the football, but actually in that conversation, there will be clues to symptoms. So it's not as straightforward as, oh, well, he didn't ask me about the 18 symptoms, because probably there will be bits of the conversation where those symptoms were evident. And that is a far more rich way of capturing that information than just saying, do you lose your keys a lot? Do you leave the washing in the washing machine? And all those cliches that it's so easy to pull off the internet and say, yeah, I do that.
That's what I have to admit, right? And I know we've spoken about my assessment offline. That is exactly what happened in my assessment. I would describe it as I waffled around general headlines that I was given and was asked certain questions. As I think about it, what I wasn't asked, and I was just looking at that document as well, and it mentions this, I was never asked a leading question. It was never trying to kind of force me to an answer. It was, I spoke a lot about, I think I presented worse, or one of the periods I presented worse was during my time working for British Airways as cabin crew between the ages of 21 and 26. Completely unfiltered disaster. But actually, a lot of the questions was I was telling stories. And as I remember it now, the clinician was head down at that point, kind of glancing up, but head down. And now I think about it, I'm thinking, oh God, there was so much in that, wasn't there?
Yeah. So in an assessment, if you're saying yes, no a lot, you're not having a good assessment. An assessment should be a conversation. It should feel like someone's wanting to get to know you as a person, rather than have you tick off boxes. And the more experienced clinicians will do that. The less experienced clinician will rely more on the diagnostic criteria. And there's a tool called the DIVA, which is it is an acronym, but it's an acronym that comes from Dutch. So don't ask me to say what the D's for, but it's essentially a diagnostic tool. And that essentially takes the 18 symptoms and turns them into questions and gives little prompts and things that might come up. And when you're starting out in ADHD diagnostics, it's a comfortable place to rely on to get those questions, so you can be sure that you've covered all 18 symptoms. As you get more experienced in having conversations about ADHD, you move further and further away from that, because you're able to go on that journey with someone and go on the tangents that they go on, and find a lot more rich description of the symptoms. So we ourselves have gone on a little bit of a tangent because I was talking about the diagnostic criteria. That is the way that a good assessment will look. It's not a series of 18 yes or no questions. A lot of us will use the adult ADHD rating scale, the ASRS,
Right.
and that is essentially a Likert scale, so an intensity scale of each of the 18 symptoms. So it's a little bit more detailed than yes or no. It's never, rarely, sometimes, often, very often. But so you can do that with a tick box exercise quite quickly, but actually getting the richness of description of those 18 symptoms is really, really important. Because that is criteria A of criteria A through E.
Right. Okay. And it's going to sound like a really silly question. I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you go through criteria A, then B, then C? Is it done in order as part of the assessment, or okay, so it is as it flows, or it can be as it flows?
So this is only about the at the moment, these early sort of A, B are about the symptoms. So B is that those symptoms were present prior to the age of 12.
Right.
Which is why we ask about childhood and why we need informant reports, school reports, someone who knew you when you were a child. There are ways of doing the assessment without that. So some of our older patients won't have anyone still around that knew them when they were a child. In DSM-5 it was 12, in DSM-4, and I can remember those days it was under the age of 7, and those criteria in DSM-4 were very much written around the diagnosis of children. So it's since DSM-4 moving into DSM-5 that the recognition that some adults wouldn't have that depth of quality of information about their childhood that we would have looked for in DSM-4, and might not be able to remember back to pre-7, but may have some memories of later primary school years. And
you were talking about as well, it doesn't matter if you don't have all the information, I think. Was that what you were hinting as well?
The more information you've got, the better. And it's I won't diagnose someone if I can't get anything about before they were 12. But there are a range of ways of getting that from your own memory, from conversations about primary school. So sometimes I'll spend a bit of time if we can't get school reports and we can't get someone who knew you as a child, might spend some time talking about primary school and what it was like. Talking about memories of the schoolyard, what was happening while you were learning to read, write, do maths, all those sorts of things. Because often you can capture that richness within that conversation. There are some rating scales we can use as well, which add a bit of validity to the narrative that we pick out from there. So it is one of those things that people say, I haven't got any school reports, or I haven't got this, or I haven't got that. That's not something to worry about. That's something for the person assessing you to guide you on, really. That's what a good assessment would look like. It's not, oh, well, if you haven't got school reports, I can't diagnose you. That is not a good response.
So there's two things that jump to mind. I'll go with the first one now, which is looking at the, as the document calls it, the 3 Ps: persistent, pervasive, problematic. If you were in that scenario where you're trying to understand the childhood and you don't have reports, what do you think you're basing, or what would you be basing problematic on? What would be something that would sort of prick up your ears and go, that sounds like somebody who struggled, if there wasn't a report to back it up, or a parent that could sort of add validity to it?
So it's that description of the symptoms. So those 18 symptoms, are they there? Can you remember times where you were criticised because you were presenting with one of those symptoms? Talking about how that impacted on you as a person. You know, how did that? So we would talk through tales of primary school, and the conversation would evolve into a symptom, and we talk through, okay, how did that get responded to by the teachers, and then How did that impact upon you, and what did you change as a result of getting into trouble with the teacher that time and ending up outside the headmaster's office? Those sorts of things give you that sense of it being persistent, pervasive, and problematic.
Would it be fair to say, although it's not my favourite word in this conversation, but I'll use it anyway, is that a sort of a process for you as a clinician, or for any clinician, of helping someone peel back a mask that they may have been, I can think of my own sons, right, particularly my oldest, to certain people, despite the fact that Catherine and I have always been BU, it's okay. I had no idea the effort he was putting in. Is that something you're trying to gently do as well?
Absolutely, and that's why an ADHD assessment needs to be a good ADHD assessment, because you are peeling back layers of protection. These are layers of defense that we put up in response to society not understanding us and us not being able to connect with what they're expecting, So there are those that have memories of really overt and visible, outwardly visible signs of ADHD, and it was always outside the headmaster's office. But there's equally the girl at the back of the classroom sitting quietly daydreaming, looking out the window, not getting the notes down. I made a gender bias there as well, and so there's a lot of gender bias in ADHD diagnostics, and I think there are as many boys quietly sitting zoned out at the back of the classroom, not following and making notes, as there are girls. So sometimes it's about capturing that as well. So that story might not be, I was always outside the headmaster's office, but I was always running around my friends trying to find out what the homework was, because I didn't get it written down in time. I didn't hear what the teacher was saying. But when you're assessing someone in that way, I find it a lot easier to spot when someone is sort of embellishing the truth in order to meet the criteria. And that does happen. That does happen.
Really?
I'm not saying that there are much easier ways. You said at the start of the podcast that this isn't about people trying to access stimulants. So there are much easier ways of getting hold of stimulant drugs if that's what you want, and than torturing yourself through an ADHD assessment.
This is a very expensive way.
It's an expensive way of doing something that, if you ask in the right nightclubs at the right time, someone will put you in touch with someone who can get that if that's what you're looking for. And it's probably a lot cheaper as well. Just in terms of drug costs, never mind going through the assessment process and having what is probably the most... I've been a mental health nurse for 30 years. I did the maths the other day, and it's 30 years I've been a mental health nurse, and an ADHD diagnostic assessment is the most comprehensive mental assessment you will ever have.
Okay, so which leads me to this question then. History taking then. You say comprehensive. What, given this document was written that we're referencing, does that mean to you there have been variances in the interpretation of what comprehensive may mean?
Oh, of course there are. Yeah. It's going back to that tick box exercise. It's how deep do you want to delve into someone's story, because in every aspect of someone's story, because ADHD is pervasive, wherever you look, it's there if you ask the question. But you have to be looking. If we're looking at history taking, which I suppose this is a good point at criteria B to look at that, you have to be looking everywhere. I had it levelled at me recently that as a nurse I wouldn't take a comprehensive medical history for someone, and I might mistake someone's physical health problem for ADHD, which is completely untrue. Ask a comprehensive medical history as well, and look for indicators of genetically passed on conditions that could look like ADHD, and then we have to work back and discount that as being an explanation. So taking that history isn't just about the symptoms of ADHD. It isn't just about the medical history and the physical things that can look like ADHD. It's also about taking that psychiatric history, so that history of your mental well-being, which goes right back to infancy, really. We look at what the pregnancy was like all the way through to current day, which most general psychiatry, if you're being assessed for bipolar, we don't ask about what pregnancy was like, what your days as a toddler were like, but we do in ADHD because we have to, on account of ADHD being something that has always been there. The other side of that is it has to have always been there. Therefore, if something happens that could be an issue that creates symptoms of inattention, if those symptoms were there prior to that event, be that a traumatic event or the development of hypothyroidism, for example, if you can evidence that those symptoms were there before that diagnosis and that the onset of that physical health problem or that psychological response, then you can quite confidently say that the inattention isn't as a result of those other diagnoses. They are coexisting conditions rather than a different diagnosis.
Now, you interestingly raise a point there, and I think that crops up in that document section about history taking. And again, just to sort of paraphrase, it talks about very high rates of comorbidity of other things, conditions, call it what you want, conditions with ADHD, can make a proper history check a considerable task. And it does say ADHD should not be diagnosed when another condition better explains symptoms and impairments. I'm going to presume that with all the training in the world, there is a certain amount of experience that's needed as well in order to be confident about that when you're faced with someone. And is that also, therefore, why the headline I hear a lot is misdiagnosis? And I understand there are lots, particularly, again, gender bias, I know, but particularly women as young girls who may get different diagnosis first, whether it's, something to do with emotion or attachment or, personality disorders, and then later in life, oh no, actually that was ADHD. Can it be the other way though? And I'm presuming it can because of that paragraph.
So yes, it can. It can. We have to remember that living with ADHD is stressful. I know you and I remember that every day, and anybody living with ADHD remembers that every day. It's stressful, and it's almost part and parcel of having an adolescence with ADHD that there's an element of anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
If your ADHD isn't diagnosed, it's more likely that that's the case than not. So the majority of ADHD assessments that I do will be talking about the onset of anxiety, the onset of low mood and that self-criticism, and that starting to become aware of difference and what does that mean to me. So teasing out what is a coexisting condition that is coming as a consequence of living with ADHD as compared to a completely different diagnosis is a really important part of an ADHD assessment, and a good ADHD assessment report will comment on the relationships between those coexisting conditions. So we've sort of skipped ahead to category E in the diagnostic criteria. So the symptoms don't occur exclusively during the course of schizophrenia, another psychotic disorder, or are not better explained by another mental disorder, is what the wording of category E is. But that's essentially, is this something else? And I think that is where the less good quality assessments fall down. They don't go into enough detail about the relationship between other diagnoses, and give that explanation of how all of these different features of things that tick boxes in other diagnoses relate to one another, and formulate that into an understanding of the person's experience, because that's what a good assessment does. You should come away.
Is that what C and D do? then? You say we skipped
So
ahead to E. Is that
C
what's
and D.
missing if it's not good?
So C and D we should cover before we answer that. C and D are about the fact that it isn't just happening in one setting. So it's not that is. So this is one that often people fall down on because teachers aren't noticing the symptoms at school. So they say, well, it's not happening at school, it's just happening at home. So it must be something about the home environment, where actually it's often that the child is masking that and then coming home. And
So
we've talked about that before on the podcast.
Yeah, now I've got somebody I know very well who is currently going through that exact thing. Has had, went for an assessment, and because school can't verify that the way their child presents is the same, so the way their child presents at school matches what they're being told happens at home, they're being told by the clinician, therefore we're not going to be able to go anywhere with ADHD.
Yeah, so this puts an awful lot of pressure on the teachers, doesn't it? It's almost like we're asking the teachers to diagnose the ADHD without the teacher saying, yeah, those symptoms are there, we can't call it ADHD. Let me read out what criteria C says. Several symptoms are present in 2 or more settings, for example, at home, school or work, with friends or relatives, in other activities. That's what the criteria say. They don't say at school or work and at home. And often an assessor will say, if it's not happening at school or work, then it isn't ADHD. However, we know that people mask, people put a lot of effort into not being seen to be inattentive and hyperactive in their primary activity because they don't want to. They've had an adolescence of I don't want to be criticised like this anymore, so I hide this. And the criteria are very clear that it's got to be 2 settings, but it doesn't have to be home and school, home and work. So often I'll say, but do they go to Brownies? Do they go to a karate club? What other set? It just has to be another setting to remove the potential that it is the home environment that's causing the issue, which could be the case. However, if that's also happening at Brownies and those symptoms are evident at Brownies as well, when the potentially, for example, the abusive parent is not there, but we're still seeing that those symptoms that are meeting the other criteria, then we've got a second setting.
Okay, so let me give you a hypothetical then, because I'm now thinking of lots of scenarios here. And I've heard that so often from multiple sources we were told school couldn't verify it, so they couldn't consider ADHD rather than 2 other sources, which is interesting. Okay. So if we have a parent, for example, with a child, and the parents say, look, their room's a bomb site, they're constantly losing things, constantly disorganized, tempers flaring up every day when they can't find things, and literally 3 days out of 5 when we go to school, there's a phone call saying, I've forgotten. Phone, PE kit, homework, whatever. But school don't see it because the parents are in a position to rescue the child and turn around, go home, pick that up and take it before it becomes a detention, a behaviour point or whatever. If you were to hear that, would you then be asking, because it sounds to me that the question you're asking is, well, hold on a minute, so what is going on there? Is it because the parents are rescuing the child and making sure they don't get detentions because that's going to make them suffer more? Or is it something else? Because to me, that sounds like there's an element of me, and I've wanted to say before, just don't take the stuff.
Okay,
they've forgotten it. Right, don't take it then.
So that's the way to jump through the hoop of the diagnostic criteria, it seems. However, is it not, and I know this is very pertinent to you, is it not right to get in the car and take that thing? Because it is, isn't it? Because that's what you do as a parent. You love your child, you get in the car and you go and you take it. And it doesn't matter whether Mr. Smith is aware that's happened or not. The kit is there. And what we often see is what we refer to as scaffolding. So the supports that are there around the person being assessed are amazingly good. And should you be the victim of your own success, your own strength as a parent, because you're supporting your child? No, you don't withdraw that support, but it needs to be considered and explained. So again, a good assessment will explore that. Why, if you're saying those symptoms are there, why are the teachers not seeing it? They're not seeing it because I've got a stash of school ties. So if school tie gets lost, there's another one. So you don't notice that they're not coming into school with a school tie because I've got a supply of 10. It doesn't matter if your PE kit is left in a pile as a goalpost on the school field because I've got a spare PE kit. All of those sorts of things hide these symptoms. But of course, as parents, that's what you do. And I don't think you should stop doing that in order to jump through a hoop and tick a box on someone's diagnostic criteria. It's for the person who's doing the assessment to understand that and explore that. And often in our assessments, we will comment on the scaffolding and the support that's around, because by describing that, by saying mum has a drawer full of school ties because Billy is so prone to losing his tie, that's evidence. That's evidence of impairment at school. Why else would mum have a drawer full of ties?
Yeah, I can think back to my own diagnosis again now, and that's what was said about my wife. She was essentially my scaffolding,
Yeah.
It was actually directly said.
If you are loved, the person who loves you will be doing things to support you that will hide your symptoms. That shouldn't be taken away in order to meet the standard of the assessment. The assessment should meet that and understand that. So this brings us on to D, doesn't it? Which is the final. Well, it's the penultimate, but we've already talked about the final. The D is there's clear evidence that the symptoms interfere with or reduce the quality of functioning, whether that's social, school, work, wherever. And that is where the richness comes in.
Yeah, isn't it?
But that is also where the subjectivity comes in.
Big word, that, isn't it? Functioning.
Yeah. So in psychiatry, we talk about impairment, we talk about functioning, and it's some unpleasant language, but it's language that has to be used in order to define something being atypical.
Do you know what, Lee? I hear what you say. I don't mind that term. I just think it, in those terms about impairment of functioning, I think that kind of hits me in the gut when you say that, because I know that. I mean, I know you must as well, but that really is like yeah, okay. I know exactly what that means, and it hurts.
Yeah. It is the core of a diagnosis of ADHD. So as the literature has become more refined in understanding ADHD, this is where the diagnosis is. Yes, you have to meet all the other criteria. Yes, you have to rule out the other potential causes of these symptoms. However, if there are all of those symptoms there, and this was the case for Rory on Panorama. He had some symptoms. I know that the NHS consultant said none, but I think there were observable symptoms, and Mike and I would probably debate that ourselves, because this is the nature of diagnostics, isn't it? It's a subjective thing. I think, having spent time with Rory, there are symptoms of ADHD evident. There are other reasons why Rory didn't meet the criteria, which he's talked about in the media, but the key one here is, does it impact on your functioning? Does it get in the way? Does it hinder you?
Right.
Does it cause distress? And a good assessment will explore that. So having been through the most comprehensive workup of your mental health history, your medical history, your developmental history through your pregnancy, through into infancy, having done all of that, we're also looking for, and how does that affect you as a person and how you get on in life?
Right.
Because if you're losing your keys and you leave the washing in the washing machine and you fidget a bit and that, but you're not bothered by that, that's not ADHD. And I don't think anybody seeking an assessment for ADHD is going to say, well, I've got all these symptoms, but I'm not really actually that bothered. I just want to get you. I like the 4 letters. I think it would be nice to have them apply. I don't think anybody does that.
Yeah.
You come for an ADHD assessment because it's hard.
Yeah.
And I think it's the hardest part of having had a diagnosis of ADHD to get your head around that it's a disability. I still wrangle with that. I know it is on paper, but how I relate that to me, I on good days I don't consider myself disabled, yet the law does.
Mm.
And that is part of the journey in understanding your own diagnosis, and it's understanding that sometimes those symptoms of ADHD that you have are going to be disabling. They are going to impact on your ability to do what you would do on other days, and that's hard. But that has to be there. If that's not there, then it's not ADHD.
This leads me to a question. Somebody referred to ADHD as a spectrum recently, and I kind of went, is it? Now, I think what they were saying is people present ADHD differently, which I understand. Now, I have this diagnosis, severely disabling combined subtype. Does that mean when I sat in front of my clinician, I ticked every box to the max, and it was a what would that mean, and what does it mean to the individual?
So criteria A says you have to have more than 5 symptoms in order to tick criteria A. If you've got 5, that doesn't mean it's mild, as compared to 9 means it's severe. That's not what we're saying at all. So the mild through to severe is nothing to do with the symptoms as such. The mild to severe sits with the impact on your functioning, and it's a subjective measure. So it's a subjective interpretation of the comprehensive information we've gathered.
True.
And so it's the severity is a descriptor of the impairment, not of the number of symptoms that you have. So it's possible to have inattentive subtype ADHD that is severe with 5 symptoms of inattention, and that's it. Yeah, but
because of the impact,
you can have mild combined presentation ADHD with 9 and 9.
Yeah, you see, I've just been kicked in the stomach metaphorically again with that one. Yeah, that makes now more sense, because I can now look back.
Well, that kick in the stomach is exactly what I was just saying, isn't it? About wrangling with the idea of disability. Because somebody has made that subjective statement that, those things you told me are a problem, well, are actually really severe as compared to other people I've met with those problems.
Yeah, it's okay. I guess then this maybe leads into the if you think we're at the right place, the next phase. So if that's how a good diagnosis or a good assessment should be put together, if that's what we're looking for and what we're assuming we will receive, right, is this balance, is this good check of our history, is this collecting all or as much relevant information as is required to make that assessment against the criteria, against those check boxes, to then say, again, in my case, severely disabling. The next bit really is, we're going to get a report. This is what this paper was about, wasn't it? It's about the assessment reports that get sent to GPs and say why. Yeah. As the person receiving, do you think there should be, or there is a lack of understanding about what good looks like in that regard as well?
Absolutely. And it comes from this idea that the doctor can say, I am diagnosing you with this. So I've seen letters that just say, I saw this person on such and such a day. I found them to meet the criteria for a diagnosis of ADHD. This is what I suggested they do, and it be, one side of A4, and that's it. That's what they get. And there may be more notes attached to that, but no, you never see those. And what the paper that we're sort of structuring today's conversation around says is that that's not okay. The report should be, and I agree with this, it should be a standalone document or series of documents that describe everything we've talked about, so that anyone who understands the diagnostic process can come along and see the journey that the clinician has been on through to the decision. And the paper that we're referencing says exactly that. So in box 1, it talks about what should be there.
It does, doesn't it? Yes, what I was just going to say. That's okay. We are going to share a link to this, but yeah, when on the second page, box 1 does a really good explanation of what it should be there. There's just a paragraph, if I can, that I would like to read. And I guess, I say this a lot. If you want to leave us a comment or tell us if this happened for you, fine. Please don't name clinicians. Just did it happen for you? After diagnosis, it is important to provide the patient with a detailed explanation and psychoeducation about ADHD in understandable language. The assessor must allow the patient time to reflect on the diagnosis and the opportunity to ask follow-up questions. Psychological issues should be discussed, including educational, occupational, and social impacts. I now think the penny has just dropped. Because if I were a GP and somebody came to me with the kind of thing you were just describing, which is I'm Dr. So-and-so, or I'm Mr. So-and-so, and I saw this person, and they tick this box, and I say ADHD, give them drug. I can see how some GPs may just sit there and go, why?
Yeah.
And, because you want me to take over this shared care agreement. That's what we hear a lot. You want me to dispense stimulant, non-stimulant medication. Can I have a bit more information?
This is more complex than that, because you're jumping ahead to the prescribing of treatment. After diagnosis, there should be an opportunity to have your emotional reaction to that. And anybody who's been diagnosed with ADHD knows about the roller coaster. I know that you were putting a few weeks back, you were putting your sort of week by week memories of what it's like, and it is. There are phases to it, just like there are phases to any change, any news. You have reactions to that, and those change. And without guidance through that, it can be a terrifying experience, because you have been redefined.
Oh, yeah, totally.
That's what a diagnosis does. It says, all those things that you thought were one thing and you blamed yourself, and that's why you're anxious and depressed. Well, actually, there's an explanation for this in the structure and function of your brain.
Yeah.
To just then go, bye, is a bit harsh, isn't it?
Well done.
Oh, you've broken your leg. Bye.
Yeah. Yes, correct. It's broken.
Yeah. That is, yes, when you get to the point of having a formulated diagnosis, you have done something. But have you helped someone in their journey? Have you answered the original question, which is this ADHD? Does this explain? And what can I do about it? Because that's the question people come with, isn't it? It's tell me whether or not this is ADHD, and help me understand what to do about that. So you've only done half a job if you've sort of ticked the boxes in box 1 and done that great comprehensive thing that we've talked in detail about, because then someone needs some time and to just take a step back and say, whoa, okay, that was harsh.
Don't you ever?
After most assessments I say, just go and sit quietly for at least an hour, get yourself a drink, just sit and allow the thoughts to happen, because they will. This is big news. that you've just been given, and you will have a reaction to that. And then there should be that opportunity, at least the offer of an opportunity to come back with questions, whether that be with another appointment, which if it's private can be expensive, or whether, can I just send you a couple of questions by email and get a written response? That's to be negotiated, but there should be an opportunity to ask questions and pick apart what's happened in the assessment that has been written about. And yes, then it's time to move along to thinking about treatment. And
so can I just clarify that term? Because I think in episode 1, we spoke about the NICE guidelines for adults being pretty clear about, I suppose in summary, pills and skills, or skills and pills, a combination of
it's the multimodal approach is the phrase it uses.
Yeah, that's the word, multimodal, right. Okay. That to me sounds like a confirmation of that's the only and the right approach. It has to be multimodal. But I suppose what's important for me, what I'm getting is this thing of we have to be given time to digest the fact that our life has literally just been changed.
Yeah.
We may know that we have struggled. We probably have got a damn good idea that life's been difficult, which is why we're sat in front of someone like you now. But nonetheless, boy, oh boy, should we be given a bit of decompression time and a bit of wow. Right?
Yeah. Having been on both sides of the table in this, I know from my experience of diagnosis, and this is something we haven't yet talked about today, the raft of questionnaires that comes. That as a company we send out endless questionnaires because it's an efficient way of getting yes or no ticks in boxes. Do you lose your keys? How old were you when you started walking? All those sorts of bits of information can be put down on a questionnaire and gathered. But I remember filling out what is essentially the list of symptoms that we talked about, the DIVA earlier.
Yeah.
Essentially my own DIVA. Now at that point I'd filled out hundreds of these for other people. But when I did my own, it was a completely different experience. Because
Why?
I was looking at myself, because I was peeling back my layers and I was having to expose what I'd done pre-assessment and say, oh, yeah, that did happen in childhood, and this is what it looked like where I'd hidden that. So sometimes it can be quite intense to be given that list of questionnaires, and we will always say if you can't fill that out, it's okay. We'll work through that with you, because it can be anyway a really distressing thing to do, and it can take a long time. It took me hours to fill my own out. I can rattle through one with someone in an hour and a half.
Is it because it kept hitting you so hard with every question?
Yeah, because not only was I having to think about myself, I was relating that to every patient I'd ever seen, and questioning myself, because I'd not considered it to be ADHD. But then when I sat down with that tool and started picking it apart, so that was even before I'd had the assessment, and my assessment was very much a wham bam approach. It was just this, and it was done in a way that was effective, and it got some level of richness of understanding. And then it sort of sped up towards the end to fill in the gaps, because apparently I talk too much. I don't think I do, but that's in my report. So, and then I was sent the report, and it was there in black and white, and someone qualified to say it was saying, yeah, you do meet the criteria for this diagnosis, and that itself, seeing it there in black and white, your name next to this diagnosis, it is a thing. It's a thing that you have to deal with. So if a report just says, yeah, you've got it, and nothing else, and no explanation of the journey that the person took to understand you as a person, I don't think that's a very kind way of diagnosing someone with ADHD. It's not a supportive way. It's not a therapeutic way of delivering a diagnosis. So in my practice, I suppose because I've done it a bit longer, my assessment is taking you on a journey, and it's a conversation. It's not an examination as such. It's a conversation which allows you to talk about things that you want to talk about, that you're bringing, that make you think it's ADHD as opposed to something else. And I think a good quality assessor will make it comfortable. For all it's an uncomfortable thing to have to do, there are elements of it that can be done in conversation where you feel like you're having a chat with someone, and it's a lot more relaxed. Where it feels less relaxed is where it's, oh, I've got to tick this box and I've got to tick that box. Well, there's pressure then to say what needs to be said to put the tick in the box, whereas a conversation allows for a lot more natural human exchange, and that needs to then be captured in a report that tells everyone how that journey happened and the information that came up in that, and should have comments about interpreting what came up in that conversation. So I noticed they fidget. Is a really sort of headline one. There are all sorts of subtleties that sort of come with experience. But that should be there in the report, because that then you can read over and over again. And people do read their reports over and over again, because people say, I think it's quite natural to question your diagnosis. And lots of people after Panorama were saying, oh, I've questioned my diagnosis. You should have a good quality assessment report to go back to and go, oh, yeah, I do meet those criteria because it's spelled out in my assessment report. If it's not spelled out in your assessment report, how can you check that diagnosis is valid? And you'll want to.
What do you do? Right, 30-second answer, right, on the spot. What do you do if you do suddenly go back and you don't have a detailed report, or one that you feel is detailed, and you suddenly think, I don't know now. I'm not sure now.
We have this where people want to transfer to us for treatment. And this happens, so it's not just psychiatrists that diagnose ADHD, it's not just nurse specialists, although that is a bulk of the diagnostic team that's going on. It's mostly psychiatrists. There are some of us nurse specialists with enough experience to do this. There are other disciplines that are diagnosing as well, and one of those is psychologists. And psychologists will diagnose ADHD with less of a medical angle to it. So sometimes we get a referral of someone wanting to be prescribed medication because they've been diagnosed by a psychologist. And in that case, we would have to fill in the gaps in the assessment, so that the medical history might not be as good a quality as would support prescribing, so we'd do a bit more in-depth on that. Sometimes, yes, we get, this is my diagnostic letter. Yes, Dr. What's his name says it's definitely ADHD. In that case, what we tend to recommend is exercising your rights under the Data Protection Act, because that doctor will have records with your name on, with more detailed notes, or should have, and you have the right to that information under the Data Protection Act.
Okay.
So if they say, the first step is to go back to them and say, well, look, this is a very top level letter. Can I have the more detailed summary? Some providers will charge to release the extra information, but they can't.
Sure they will.
They can't. Yeah, they can't though, can they? Because it's Data Protection Act.
But they'll try.
They'll try. They'll say you, but they can't, because you have the right to that information if it's stored and it's about you. Therefore, sometimes it's a subject access request under the Data Protection Act for all of your records with that provider. So that's something that you can do to get the more detailed information. They have the right to redact certain elements of that. So sometimes we'll get information from someone and they don't want that information to be shared. You know, a great uncle such and such wants to comment such and such, but he doesn't consent to us sharing that information with the patient. We have to respect his right to that as well. So
okay.
there are subtleties. However, if the information is about you and it exists and it's stored
Yours.
and it sits behind this diagnostic letter that just says Billy has ADHD, you have a legal right to that information and you can ask for it. So we do that in situations where there's a poor quality assessment report. Sometimes that then is not the best quality information as well, but you have the right to it. Don't pay for it.
Can I just go backwards? It's sort of in and around that, but there's a statement, that paragraph I just read, I'm just wondering, because it mentions psychosocial issues should be discussed, including educational, occupational, and social. Am I right in thinking that's another way of saying you've got a right to expect perhaps more than one letter? Like, do I need a letter for work? Do I need a letter for school or university? Do I need a letter for me? Or are there different styles of approaching that?
There's all sorts of different styles of approaching that, and that's not saying that there should be a letter for your boss and a letter for your university tutor or a letter for your class teacher. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is that there should be consideration to the impact of this news, this diagnosis, on those situations, and what you can do about it. So there should be conversations about the Equality Act and the fact that ADHD is a protected characteristic. There should be conversation, if you're a driver, about what the impact of the diagnosis is on your car insurance, for example. That, or direction to some information about that, and the opportunity to ask questions based on what you read on that information, if you're able to, you know, if it's possible for you to go and do that. If you say, well, I can't find that information and I need you to tell me, it's reasonable to expect an answer to that question. Yes. And it is a bit of a grey area.
Okay. So what does good look like? Let's go back to the topic then. What, after diagnosis for you, as a patient, I'm going to put this to you, when you were diagnosed, what's good to you? What would you like to have gone, I went away with this, and that was, you know, my minimum expectation, for example?
Based on the last 10 minutes of conversation, the post-diagnostic care I got missed this bit. And this is where the nice guidance falls down, isn't it? Because nice guidance, and I've said it myself on this podcast, the first thing we do for an adult who's diagnosed with ADHD is give medication. And that is the first treatment intervention. However, there is this grey area between diagnosis and treatment of helping someone make sense of it. And I, in my practice, will try and do that on the journey. So through the assessment, start to drop in these bits of understanding and the explanation of how this got to this position and some of the things that can be done about it. But that's not necessarily what people are going to do across the board, nor is it what's expected. But a good post-diagnosis response should be about making sense of and continuing on that journey. The diagnosis is a start point, not an end point. But I think for clinicians, it can often be perceived as an end point. Oh, well, I've done a great job. I've done my assessment and that is the job done. But that is the start of a different phase of experience. You've answered the question, is it ADHD? But you haven't said, this is what to do about it.
Mm-hmm. So
a good assessment will lead to a detailed report, for sure. And box one on the article that we're talking about today outlines what that should look like, in lots of depth. Then there is this blurry bit about, okay, what does that mean for me as a person in society and how do I adjust to it? Which is actually a lot of what people are looking for when they seek a diagnosis. not the
Yeah.
detailed report that explains why someone thinks it's ADHD. Actually, now you've told me it's ADHD, what the hell do I do about this?
Yeah.
Is not a question that gets answered in the guidance. And I think that's where a lot of people find ADHD care lacking, because there isn't that guidance. It's just, okay, yeah, you're one of that 3 to 5% of the population that is inattentive or hyperactive or both. And I think that's where communities like the WhatsApp group that you provide, and other there are endless amounts of support groups. That's what I think.
Therefore,
That's what's evolved to fill that gap. Because the experience, and it's my experience, I think it's your experience as well, is, okay, I've taken you to the point of saying, yes, it's ADHD, and there's this gap, and yes, I'll give you some medications that may or may not work, and there's a different process to support with that, and there's all sorts of science and good practice guidance around that, but there's this gap where you're just left in a void of, okay, what does that actually mean? So a really good assessment will meet you in that gap and say, okay, how's it feeling? What's it like? What's going on? How are you reacting to that? Reassure you that a lot of what you're feeling is something that lots of people who've gone before have felt. That there is no typical response, and there's certainly no, oh, okay, that's it. No, I just take my stimulants and I get on with it. But the pressures of society push us to say, okay, well, we've got these amazing treatments, let's just get on with that, rather than, whoa, you've just completely redefined my life.
Now, can I ask you a question? I've just read what it says in the report, but I'm going to ask from because you describe things in a real human way. Do you think, as patients, if that's the right term, as people newly diagnosed, there is misunderstanding about what the term shared care means?
I think there's misunderstanding that extends beyond people who might be subject to it. I think there's misunderstandings about it in medical colleagues, people who are actually doing shared care, what that actually means. Yeah.
Because we talk about it a lot. And actually last year, post the documentary, there was this period where GPs are refusing shared care agreements. That's the phrase, shared care, and I was getting told it. Now, I've just read what this report says about shared care several times, and I've gone, I'll be honest with you, that's not quite what my interpretation was. And I understand, I think, why it's up for, not debate, why perhaps it's confusing sometimes. And also why, if a GP did receive what they felt was an inadequate assessment report, why they might be hesitant to go, can I have a bit more information? And more to the point, I didn't realise this until I've just read that paragraph, although I think you've mentioned this before. Shared care in England is a euphemism for transferring extra contractual work to primary care, as in GPs, typically unfunded, with continuing access to specialist oversight when indicated. Now, you mentioned this, and the pennies, I'm having lots of penny drop moments today. Is this what you meant by, okay, if your GP does accept shared care, and for example, if there is then a shortage all of a sudden of the medication that it was recommended you were prescribed, that the GP should feel able to go back to the specialist and say, you prescribed this stimulant, you tell me what's the right thing to do now, because this person's coming to me and saying I can't access my drugs. Is that part of that sort of circular shared care agreement? It doesn't just go, right, private's done, there you go, doc.
Yeah, that's what sharing is, Matt. It's called shared care because the care is shared, and I don't think that's very well understood.
No.
And the way the authors of this article have phrased it is that it's very skillfully phrased, because GPs do feel like it's just, okay, we're done, dumped. And if anything comes up, that's on you until we review in a year's time. And that is not the wording of the majority of shared care agreements, because it's not It's not about shared care. There is a shared care agreement, and that's what shared care is about. It's about having a signed agreement that the specialist and the GP have signed up to that spells out, if this happens, the GP will do this. If this happens, the specialist will do that. That a shared care agreement has, it's quite a lengthy document. If it's written well, and there are standards to them, and but they can be altered. It's possible to say and we do this at Divergence. So some GPs aren't happy to do the 6 monthly blood pressure monitoring. So we have an option on our shared care agreement for the GP to say, I'm not going to do that. You'll have to do that with the patient if I'm going to prescribe the medication.
Okay.
Because GPs don't have the resources. It's called, that's what the extra contractual work is about in that article. It's about things like having the resources for the practice nurse to check that blood pressure, to do the weight, make sure that someone is otherwise healthy at that 6-month interval. That costs the GP, and they're a business themselves. So do they want to, where's the interest in them to fund that when they're also funding out of the budget that they get for us as patients, the cost of the drugs?
Yeah.
Because when shared care is applied, the budget that pays for those medicines is no longer the private purse. It's the NHS funding that you bring to the GP practice as a patient of that practice. So that is, they look at the cost of that agreement to them as businessmen in their own right. They also are independent businesses that gets a payment of so much from the NHS to have you on their list. So they may, my argument with GPs is often actually having a shared care agreement instead of continued separate working where I, as a private clinician, prescribe a drug outside of an agreement with you. It's actually not as safe for the patient as having that shared care agreement where we agree how we're going to work together and deal with. And it's not just about access to medicines, it's access to care. So that if you go in with some cardiac symptoms, let's say, to your GP, I've had a twinge in my heart, doctor, and you're under shared care, the GP can say, oh, that could be your stimulants. I need to speak to your ADHD specialist. With a shared care agreement, it's a lot easier because it's agreed and the terms of what the GP can expect are there. Whereas without a shared care agreement, I'm, as a private provider, under no compulsion to respond to that GP. I will as a compassionate clinician, but there's no compulsion. So sharing care is something that happens from the first moment I sign a prescription for someone. I'm already sharing care of that patient with their GP. The shared care agreement formalizes that and sets out the terms. So the understanding of what shared care isn't just misinterpreted in the public perception. It's misinterpreted because of the way certain providers will use it as a baton passing exercise. Over to you for a year until I review again and give another rubber stamp to say carry on for a year. A shared care agreement usually will have a clause in it about, if you need us, you pick up the phone and you can expect a response.
I would be amazed. No, I'm sorry, that's conceited. Certainly, I will say I did not realise that when my clinician mentioned shared care, I didn't think of it as a circular, continuing process. I thought we were just talking about drugs. I know, but I just thought we were talking about, will they prescribe the meds after titration? That was it. Genuinely, that was it. That was my perception of shared care and I'm fairly sure from what I saw last year being discussed, that was most people's interpretation. It all came down to meds. Right, Andrew, listen, I'm gonna put you on the spot, but hopefully this isn't a difficult question. This is such an important topic that we've discussed, and I'm really grateful for you giving your time and your knowledge as ever. But I wonder if you can do something, and I'll give you a minute to think about it. Could you maybe summarise what you would say are the key points that people should be looking for in assessment and the key points they're looking for after diagnosis that would give that person a sense that, okay, this is and I'll go back to the total. This is what good looks like. Not perfect, but this is what good looks like. So what would you say are, what are we looking for in an assessment?
So we're looking for an assessment against criteria that are agreed internationally. So ideally DSM-5 criteria assessment. We should be looking for an exploration of each of the 5 main headings. So that is,
Right.
do you have the symptoms? And enough of those to meet the symptom criteria. Do you have evidence of that prior to the age of 12? Do you have that in more than one setting? So not just at work or at home or at school, but or at the youth club or wherever it may be. Do you have those things impacting on the quality of your life differently than the average person? And can that not be explained by any other condition, be that psychiatric or physical health condition?
Okay.
So a good assessment will explore all of that, looking at your history from before you were born all the way to the current day, focusing on your medical history, but also looking at your psychiatric history. So any interventions that would fall under the realm of a psychiatrist. So which antidepressants have you had, that sort of stuff. Look at your social history. How has your life been impacted by these symptoms? And pull all of that information together into usually just a paragraph that sort of summarizes it nicely, and you can read it and go, yeah, that's got it. They've understood everything I've told them and pulled it all into the explanation of why they think I've got ADHD. That there are a number of ways of gathering that information. So it doesn't matter if someone sends out a raft of questionnaires or they don't send any questionnaires at all. What's important is that by the end of the process, they've gathered all of that information and handed it back to you in a way that formulates that information into an explanation of why they think it's ADHD. It's not good enough just to say, I think it's ADHD.
Yeah.
Better quality will take you on a journey through gathering that information and help you make sense of it as you go, in my opinion. I think that's a really helpful and therapeutic way of assessing someone, and also allows the clinician some room to be able to start to really understand that impairment, that the difficulties that have hit along the way, that how those symptoms have sculpted and changed your life.
Right.
So if you've got someone who's assessing you and they're asking lots of closed questions where you're saying yes, no, 15, that is not a good assessment. You should, if you're having an assessment for ADHD, be involved in a conversation. There should be tears, there should be laughter, there should be a human connection if it's going to be a good quality one. Now, it doesn't have to be there to be a good assessment. It's possible to do it in a cold and unconnected way and gather that information. But I think a good quality assessment will have a level of personal connection. Now, that doesn't have to be in person. That can be achieved on a video link if it's done well. So it doesn't have to be in person. A good assessment will say, actually, I'm not comfortable with this. We need to come back to this. I don't feel like I've got enough information. That's not the sign of a bad assessment. That's the sign of someone saying, actually, we've done enough for today, and we need to take a step back from this and think about it. So that you don't feel, because someone's saying, let's take a pause here and come back to it at another time, that's bad. That's actually someone who's saying, I've got enough to be working with at the moment, and I need some time to process what you've told me so far so that we can come back and have a more rich experience next time and really get to grips with it. So it should feel like a conversation. It shouldn't feel, although it always is, daunting. That night before your assessment, where you're thinking, oh, I'm wasting everybody's time. This isn't really ADHD. I shouldn't be doing this. The majority of people have that experience. And there are lots of common experiences, and they should be acknowledged. You know, it's normal to feel that way. So a good assessment will guide you through that process, and it be okay for you to say, actually, I don't like this, or this isn't feeling comfortable. But yeah, it's going to be an emotional experience to have a good quality ADHD assessment, because you're looking under rocks that you wish you didn't have to look under in your history. And
That's a horrible but a very true way of putting it, isn't it?
Yeah.
God.
You're turning over things that you would rather were left in your history.
Yeah, can we not?
But yeah. If you're not doing that, then are you making sense of exactly how much these symptoms, which are, as people say, everybody has those symptoms, but if you're not uncovering distress and things that you weren't even aware you'd done, then you're probably not getting a decent quality exploration of the impact that's had. So you might find then that someone says it's moderate impairment, when actually it's quite severe impairment, but you've done so well to hide that, so well to mask it, that the severity of it and the personal costs and the health costs, the social costs, the financial costs of it are overlooked, just so that we can get it across the line and say, oh yes, tick in the box, it is ADHD. I think a good quality ADHD assessment makes sense of a lot more than just those 18 core symptoms of ADHD. Yeah.
I think you're right, and I think that's why it hits so hard, right? I'm listening to all that again, and I feel like I'm going through it again. It's really strange. You know, the uncovering the rocks and the turning things over you'd really rather not. But if I think back to it now, I'm sure, like most people, like we've discussed, I know I said I thought I needed a clinical assessment because I was desperate, right? I'd reached zero tolerance for anything, and I was looking for answers. I didn't realize at the time that the process of looking for answers would be uncovering everything that I'd chosen to sort of ignore or gloss over or make light of, even. But it's the after effects. Yeah, it's definitely the after effects for me. I mean, I went in sure I had ADHD, convinced I'd get a diagnosis of ADHD, but when I was told the severity, my knees buckled. And to this day, I think, why did my knees buckle? I knew I had ADHD. To be told, like you, this is a disability. This isn't a bit of a problem. This isn't a bit, this isn't uncomfortable. You have a severely disabling condition. And I kind of went, whoa, me? And that took a long, long time to get back from. A long time to get back from. And a long time to...
I don't think I'm back from it yet. And it's what we're looking at now. I'm nearly 5 years.
Yeah.
It can't be nearly 5. It's 4 or 5 years. And I'm still wrangling with that idea. That, because for 45 years, that was my normal.
Yeah, I know.
And it was okay. I went to work and I was goosed at the end of the day, but I did my job, and I got a degree. I got a master's degree. And it was hard. It was really, really hard. And it's only the other day I realised that in both my degree and my master's degree, I had a year out.
Oh gosh, really?
Yeah, I'd completely written that out of my history. That 2 years into both, I'd had enough, and I needed to stop and just take a step back.
Wow. Isn't that astonishing?
I'm still thinking about that now, and I think that when you're talking about aftercare, yes, there is that immediately after, but there is, when you've got years and years, and your VVL project is about this, isn't it? It's when you've got those years and years of this is my normal, and I'm functioning so You know, that's okay. When someone says that was done with a disability that you didn't even know you had,
Oh,
that changes absolutely everything. You say, well, who the
yeah,
hell am I?
yeah. And am
And
I a
what is
fraud? Yeah,
disability?
yeah,
And what is prejudice? And all of
yeah.
these concepts start crashing into you, and you don't realize until those labels are attached what all of that means.
So I
So,
think I will wrap this then by saying this. On that note, an assessment, and you said this earlier, is the very, 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 very start of the process. It is by no way, assessment and diagnosis is not where this stops. It's where it all starts. And done right, a good one will set you on the right path. It will give you the information that perhaps you were looking for, whether it's uncomfortable to receive it or not. But the older I get, the more I live with this, and hearing you say that, the more I realize how important finding your tribe is, finding other people that you can say, did you, do you? And they can nod and they can say, yes, yeah, me too, that they get it. Because I don't think there's anyone with a diagnosis of this that at some point hasn't thought they were a fraud, felt like they were a burden, questioned everything about themselves. And yeah, it's important to find other people that can just sort of emotionally hold that space with you and go, yeah, and me.
because we live in a world of people. We live in a world of people where 95% of them say, "Well, yeah, I sometimes lose my car keys."
Yeah.
In a trite way, like that's the that, and it is it's the go-to symptom that I use, but that to have someone say, well, yeah, I do that, it blows apart and blows a hole in everything that you've shared in that assessment that is so much more than the frustration of losing your car keys. It defines who you are. It defines decisions that you made along the way. So it is pervasive, and it has been persistent, and by God, it's problematic.
Yeah. It is, isn't it? And it's folks, it's okay to know that. You're listening to a professional there, and I don't mean me, I mean Andrew. You're listening to a clinical professional telling you it's okay to remember that, to recognize that, to know that those things have happened. So I hope this episode really helps you. Again, please let us know. Leave us some comments. Tell us what you got from it. But if there's anything I take away from it, and unfortunately I get to talk to you most days, it's that it's actually okay for it to be a problem. It's okay for it to be very, very, very bloody difficult. And you're not putting it on.
Yeah. If it wasn't difficult, you wouldn't have been diagnosed with it. Even if that diagnostic letter only says, I'm diagnosing this person with ADHD.
There you go. There you go. Folks, listen, that was episode 8, and hopefully you now have a better idea of what a good ADHD assessment should look like, contain, and what should happen after it. If you have any questions, leave us a comment wherever you listen to this or watch this, and we will always try and respond. And if you want to join the community as it is, just as I say, go to WhatsApp communities, search for Talk ADHD, or click the link that I will remember honestly to put in here. Other than that, Andrew, thank you so much. Again, another splendid episode as far as I'm concerned. We'll keep doing it, and I will see you hopefully next week for episode 9.
Yep, speak soon. Pleasure as always.
Indeed.